The strangest part wasn't that a millionaire sent a luxury car to a waitress the next morning. It was why he believed she had saved him. At exactly 6:07 a.m., a black Bentley Flying Spur rolled slowly into a neighborhood where cars like that simply didn't exist. The early morning air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh rain from the night before. Streetlights were still glowing faintly as a few residents stepped onto their porches with coffee mugs in hand, preparing for another ordinary Thursday. Then they saw the car. Its polished body reflected the pale orange light of dawn as it stopped in front of a modest three-story brick apartment building. Curtains shifted. Front doors opened. People stared. No one in this neighborhood drove a Bentley. Certainly not the person living in apartment 3B. Inside that apartment, Emily Parker stood frozen near her tiny kitchen counter, still wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt. Her blonde hair was tied back carelessly, and a half-finished cup of coffee sat beside her. Through the window, she watched a uniformed chauffeur step out of the luxury sedan and walk toward the entrance carrying a cream-colored envelope. For a moment, Emily wondered if the driver had the wrong address. Then she remembered the conversation. 24 hours earlier. The memory returned with startling clarity. The crowded restaurant, the crystal glasses, the expensive watches, the quiet sound of rain tapping against the windows. In one sentence she probably should have kept to herself. Emily had spent 4 years working at the Sterling Room, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, long enough to understand that wealthy people revealed more than they realized. Not through words, through pauses, through nervous smiles, through the way they held eye contact when discussing things they didn't want others to know. Most customers never noticed her. To them, she was simply another waitress carrying plates and refilling glasses. Emily preferred it that way. Invisible people often saw the truth first. The chauffeur disappeared into the building. Emily's stomach tightened. Outside, several neighbors pretended to check their mail while secretly watching. Mrs. Jenkins from across the street stood completely still beside her flower garden. Even the mail carrier slowed down. Nobody understood what was happening. Truthfully, Emily wasn't sure she understood it either. She had expected many outcomes after speaking to Daniel Harrison the night before. Anger, dismissal, maybe embarrassment. But not this. Definitely not a Bentley arriving before sunrise. A knock echoed through the hallway. 3 calm taps. Emily looked toward the apartment door. Her heartbeat quickened. The envelope. Whatever was inside it connected directly to a conversation that had lasted less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds that somehow changed everything. She slowly walked across the apartment and rested her hand on the doorknob. Outside, the neighborhood remained unusually quiet, as if everyone sensed something important was unfolding. Emily took a breath, then another. Somewhere across the city, one of America's most successful millionaires had woken up this morning knowing a secret she didn't yet understand. And standing on the other side of her door was the first clue. 24 hours earlier, the rain had started just after sunset. It painted the streets of Manhattan in reflections of gold and silver as taxis rolled past crowded sidewalks, and people hurried beneath umbrellas. Inside the Sterling Room, everything felt different. Warm light glowed from crystal chandeliers. Soft piano music floated through the dining room. Expensive conversations blended with the quiet clink of glasses. Emily Parker moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing a tray on one hand while memorizing orders without writing them down. After 4 years in the restaurant, she knew every corner of the room and every type of customer. Some arrived looking for attention. Some arrived looking for deals. Some arrived carrying secrets. Emily had learned that money changed many things, but it never changed human nature. At table 14, a group of executives laughed louder than necessary. At table 6, a young couple celebrated an engagement. Near the windows, an elderly man sat alone reading financial newspapers while slowly drinking coffee. It looked like an ordinary evening. Then Daniel Harrison walked in. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Not because he demanded attention. Quite the opposite. The 41-year-old entrepreneur carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. His navy suit was perfectly tailored. His silver watch caught the light each time he checked the time. Conversations quieted as several guests recognized him. Daniel Harrison had built one of the largest software companies in America. Business magazines called him brilliant. Investors called him visionary. Employees called him demanding but fair. Emily only knew him as a regular customer who visited every few weeks. He always sat near the window. He always ordered sparkling water before dinner. And he always arrived alone. This time was different. A second man entered beside him. Richard Cole. Tall, charismatic, effortlessly confident. The kind of person who could make strangers trust him within minutes. Richard had been Daniel's closest friend for nearly 20 years. Business articles often described them as inseparable. Two men who had built success side by side. They shook hands with familiar warmth before sitting across from one another. Emily approached with menus. Daniel greeted her politely, as he always did. Richard barely looked up from his phone. It was a small detail, the kind most people would never notice. Emily noticed anyway. She poured water into their glasses and stepped away. Throughout the next hour, she returned several times, refilling drinks, delivering meals, clearing plates. Nothing unusual happened, yet something felt off. Daniel appeared relaxed. Richard did not. Every few minutes, Richard glanced toward the entrance, then toward his phone, then back to Daniel. His smile arrived a fraction of a second too late. His laughter sounded slightly forced. Small things, almost invisible things. But Emily had spent years watching people, and sometimes the smallest details spoke the loudest. At one point, Daniel excused himself to take a call. Richard remained at the table alone. The moment Daniel disappeared, Richard's expression changed completely. The smile vanished. His shoulders dropped. He stared at his phone screen with an intensity that made Emily pause. Then he typed a message quickly, deleted it, typed another. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly before he locked the phone and slipped it into his pocket. By the time Daniel returned, the smile was back. Perfect. Practiced. Convincing. Everyone in the restaurant would have believed it. Everyone except Emily. Most people believe intuition is mysterious. Emily did not. She believed intuition was simply observation arriving before explanation. The dining room remained busy as the evening continued. Waiters moved between tables. Glasses sparkled beneath warm light. Conversations rose and fell like distant waves. Yet Emily found her attention returning to table 14 again and again. Daniel Harrison looked exactly as he always did. Calm, focused, comfortable in his own success. Richard Cole looked different every time she passed by. Not dramatically different, just enough. During dessert, Daniel leaned forward and spoke enthusiastically about something on a tablet. A new project perhaps. A future acquisition. Emily could not hear the details. She only noticed Richard's reaction. Most people nod naturally when they agree. Richard nodded a fraction too often. His smile stayed fixed while his eyes drifted elsewhere. Twice he glanced toward the exit. 3 times he checked the time. When Daniel laughed, Richard laughed too. Yet somehow the laughter never reached his eyes. Emily carried a tray of coffee toward another table and remembered something her father used to say. Before his small accounting business failed years earlier, he often talked about trust. The dangerous people are not the ones who disagree with you, he would tell her. The dangerous ones are the people who agree too quickly. At the time, she had not understood what he meant. Then she watched a trusted business partner slowly destroy everything her father had built. Not through dramatic betrayal, through small hidden decisions that nobody questioned until it was too late. The memory lingered as she approached Daniel's table again. Richard was speaking now. Confident, smooth, persuasive. Daniel listened carefully, trusting completely. Emily noticed something else. Whenever Richard spoke about business, he watched Daniel's reaction more closely than the actual conversation. It was as if he cared less about the decision and more about controlling the outcome. Again, it was a small thing, easy to miss. But Emily had seen it before. Her stomach tightened. She tried to dismiss the feeling. After all, she was a waitress, not an investigator, not a financial expert, not someone who belonged in the affairs of millionaires. Yet every time she walked away, the uneasiness returned. Around 9 o'clock, she brought the check folder to the table. The meeting appeared successful. Both men seemed relaxed. Daniel thanked her politely. Richard barely acknowledged her presence. Emily placed the folder beside Daniel and started to leave. Then she stopped. Something inside her refused to move. For several seconds, she stood there listening to the quiet storm outside the windows. Rain slid down the glass in long silver lines. The restaurant lights reflected across polished marble floors. Around her, life continued normally. Yet she felt as if she were standing at the edge of a decision she could not ignore. She looked at Daniel, a man who trusted the person sitting across from him completely, a man who had no reason to doubt anything. Emily knew she could walk away. That would be easier, safer, more appropriate. Instead, she took a small blank order slip from her apron pocket. Her hand hesitated. Then she wrote a single sentence. 7 words. Nothing more, nothing less. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it inside the check folder. Her pulse quickened immediately. Perhaps she was wrong. She hoped she was wrong. Because if she was right, the next 24 hours were about to change everything. Daniel Harrison did not notice the note until several minutes later. The restaurant had begun to empty. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows as he reached for the check folder. He expected a receipt. Instead, a folded slip of paper fell onto the table. Richard glanced toward it casually. Daniel unfolded it. The message was short, simple, direct. You should take a closer look at the man sitting across from you. For a second, Daniel stared at the words without understanding them. Then he looked up. Emily was already walking toward another table. Richard laughed lightly. What is that? He asked. Daniel slid the paper back into the folder. Nothing important. Yet something about the note lingered. Not because of the accusation. Because of who had written it. Emily had served him for years. She had always been professional. Reserved. Careful. Never intrusive. Never dramatic. The idea that she would risk her job to leave a message like this made no sense. Richard continued talking about schedules, projections, and upcoming meetings, but Daniel found himself distracted. His eyes drifted toward Emily several times. She never looked back. She simply continued working, carrying plates, greeting customers, moving through the restaurant as though nothing unusual had happened. That bothered him even more. If she wanted attention, she would have stayed nearby. If she wanted something, she would have approached him directly. Instead, she seemed determined to avoid the entire situation. 30 minutes later, Daniel and Richard stepped outside. The city glistened beneath fresh rain. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement. Their driver waited at the curb. Richard spoke confidently about an important agreement scheduled for the following morning. Daniel listened, but only partially. The note remained in his mind. 7 words. That was all. 7 words from a waitress who barely knew him. It should have been easy to dismiss. Yet during the drive home, he found himself replaying the evening. Richard checking his phone. Richard watching the door. Richard smiling at strange moments. Nothing concrete. Nothing suspicious enough to matter. Still, Daniel could not shake the feeling. Shortly after midnight, he stood alone in his penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. The lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly into the distance. Usually the view brought clarity. Tonight it brought questions. On his desk sat a stack of reports related to the agreement Richard had been discussing for months. Daniel had reviewed them before, approved most of them, trusted the process, trusted Richard. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he opened the files again. Just for a few minutes, he told himself. Just to prove the note meant nothing. He began reading. 1 document became 2. 2 became 5. The clock moved past 1 in the morning. Then 2. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Inside, Daniel's expression slowly changed. Certain numbers did not match. Certain transfers seemed unusually complicated. Several approvals appeared rushed. Individually, each detail looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern he had somehow never noticed before. Daniel leaned back in silence. His office suddenly felt much colder. Somewhere across the city, Emily Parker had likely gone to sleep believing her involvement was over. She had no idea that a simple note left inside a check folder had just started the longest night Daniel Harrison had experienced in years. By 3:30 in the morning, the city outside Daniel Harrison's windows had gone quiet. Most of Manhattan was asleep. His office was not. Empty coffee cups sat scattered across the conference table. Financial reports covered nearly every surface. The deeper Daniel looked, the more uncomfortable he became. At first, the irregularities seemed insignificant. A delayed approval, an unusual transfer, a contract routed through an unfamiliar subsidiary. Any one of them could have been explained away. Together, they told a different story. Daniel loosened his tie and rubbed his eyes. He had built his company by trusting data instead of assumptions. Yet somehow, over the past several years, he had stopped applying that rule to one person. Richard Cole, his closest friend, his most trusted advisor. The realization felt almost impossible. Daniel opened another file, then another. Each document revealed connections to the same network of transactions. Money moving between accounts. Authorizations approved through channels Richard personally controlled. Deadlines accelerated without explanation. Nothing illegal on the surface. Nothing dramatic. Just a carefully constructed maze that directed influence, information, and financial leverage toward one man. Daniel stared at the screen in silence. His phone buzzed. A message from Richard. Looking forward to tomorrow. Biggest day of the year. Sleep well, brother. Daniel read the text twice. Then a third time. For the first time in 20 years, the message felt different. Not comforting. Calculated. He set the phone down without replying. An hour later, he called the head of internal compliance. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, Daniel had authorized a confidential review of every transaction connected to Richard's department over the previous 18 months. The compliance director sounded confused, concerned, but Daniel insisted. At 6:15 in the morning, the first results arrived. Daniel stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows as the sun began rising over the East River. The report contained only 12 pages. It was enough. Several transactions had bypassed standard review procedures. Multiple consulting firms receiving large payments were linked through hidden ownership structures. The final page contained a list of signatures authorizing the activity. Richard's name appeared repeatedly. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Not because of the money. His company could survive financial losses. What shook him was the betrayal. 20 years of friendship. 20 years of trust. 20 years of believing someone was standing beside him while that same person had quietly been positioning himself for personal advantage. Daniel closed the report and remained still for a long moment. The sunrise painted the glass towers of Manhattan gold. Somewhere, commuters were beginning their day. Somewhere, Richard was probably preparing for another meeting, unaware that everything had changed overnight. And somewhere across the city, Emily Parker was likely pouring her first cup of coffee before work, completely unaware that a simple note had triggered the discovery of something no executive, auditor, attorney, or consultant had managed to uncover. Daniel looked at the folded slip of paper resting beside the report. 7 words. That was all it had taken. He picked up his phone and made a single call. "Prepare a car," he said quietly. "I need to visit someone this morning." At 6:07 that morning, the black Bentley stopped in front of Emily Parker's apartment building. By 6:10, half the neighborhood was watching. Emily opened her door to find a uniformed chauffeur standing patiently in the hallway. In his hands was the cream-colored envelope she had seen from the window. "Miss Parker," he asked politely. Emily nodded. "This was sent for you." She accepted the envelope carefully. The paper felt expensive, heavy, deliberate. The chauffeur offered a respectful smile before turning toward the stairs. Within seconds, he was gone. Emily closed the door and stood silently in her small apartment. Outside, she could still hear distant voices from curious neighbors trying to understand why a luxury car had arrived at her building before sunrise. She looked down at the envelope. No company logo, no return address, just her name written in elegant handwriting. For a moment, she considered leaving it unopened. Then she carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter. Nothing else. No check. No business card. No legal documents. Just a letter. Emily unfolded the page and began to read. As her eyes moved across the words, her expression slowly changed. Daniel Harrison had written it himself. The first sentence immediately caught her attention. "Thank you for saying what nobody else was willing to say." Emily sat down at her kitchen table. The coffee beside her had already gone cold. Daniel explained that he had spent the entire night reviewing information he should have examined months earlier. He never described specific details. He did not mention numbers or contracts. He simply admitted one difficult truth. The warning had been justified. Emily read the sentence twice. Then a third time. She felt relief more than satisfaction. She had spent the previous evening questioning her decision, wondering whether she had crossed a line, wondering whether she had unfairly judged someone she barely knew. Now she knew she had not imagined it. The letter continued. Daniel wrote that throughout his career he had relied on experts, analysts, attorneys, consultants, and advisors. Yet the person who finally forced him to ask the right questions had been a waitress carrying a check folder. Emily smiled faintly. It sounded exactly like something a man in Daniel's position would never expect to write. At the bottom of the page, another sentence stood alone. It was shorter than the rest. Simpler. Sometimes distance makes people impressive. Observation makes them honest. Emily stared at those words for a long moment. Then she folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. A knock interrupted the silence. This time it was not a chauffeur. It was Mrs. Jenkins from across the street. Emily opened the door to find the older woman trying very hard to appear casual. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked. Emily glanced past her. Several neighbors immediately looked away and pretended they were not watching. The sight almost made her laugh. "Everything is fine," she replied. Mrs. Jenkins nodded slowly. "Good. Because that car out there has everybody inventing stories." Emily looked through the window toward the Bentley parked outside. The morning sun reflected brightly from its polished surface. Yet what stayed in her mind was not the car, not the attention, not even the letter itself. It was the realization that somewhere across Manhattan, Daniel Harrison was probably facing the consequences of a truth he had almost missed. And for the first time since leaving that note, Emily wondered what would happen next. Later that afternoon, Daniel Harrison sat alone in a conference room that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The polished table, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline beyond the glass. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same. Across from him sat 3 senior compliance officers and 2 outside auditors. Stacks of reports covered the table. Every page pointed toward the same conclusion. What had started as a simple review had uncovered a pattern stretching back nearly 2 years. Decisions had been influenced. Information had been redirected. Opportunities had been quietly positioned to benefit a small network connected to Richard Cole. None of it had happened overnight. That was the hardest part to accept. Trust had not been broken in a single moment. It had been worn away gradually, hidden beneath years of friendship and familiarity. Daniel listened as the auditors explained their findings. He asked precise questions. He requested evidence. He reviewed timelines. By the end of the meeting, there was little left to debate. The facts spoke for themselves. Around noon, Richard arrived for what he believed would be a routine strategy session. Employees noticed immediately that something felt different. Conversations became quieter. Office doors remained closed. The usual easy confidence that surrounded Richard seemed absent. Daniel met him privately. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Just 2 men sitting across from one another in a room filled with silence. For nearly 20 years, they had shared victories, setbacks, celebrations, and risks. Now they sat separated by documents neither of them could ignore. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When Richard finally left the building, he did so alone. Several employees watched from a distance. Nobody knew exactly what had happened. They only understood that an important chapter had ended. Daniel remained in the conference room long after everyone else had gone. The afternoon sun slowly crossed the skyline. Shadows stretched across the floor. His phone rang several times. He ignored every call. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about profits, acquisitions, or quarterly results. He was thinking about trust, about how easily people confuse familiarity with character, about how often warnings arrive from unexpected places. His eyes drifted toward the folded note resting beside the reports. The paper looked ordinary, almost insignificant. Yet it represented the moment everything changed. Daniel thought about Emily Parker, a waitress living in a modest apartment, someone with no influence inside corporate boardrooms, someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from getting involved. Most people would have remained silent. Most people would have convinced themselves it was none of their business. Emily had done the opposite. She had accepted the risk of being wrong because she believed ignoring the feeling would be worse. As evening approached, Daniel made another decision. This one had nothing to do with audits or contracts. He instructed his assistant to arrange a dinner reservation at the Sterling Room for the following night. Not for a business meeting, not for negotiations. He simply wanted a conversation. Because after everything that had happened, one question remained unanswered. How had a waitress seen what an entire company had missed? The following evening, the Sterling Room looked exactly as it had 24 hours earlier. The chandeliers glowed warmly. Soft music drifted through the dining room. Glasses reflected golden light across polished tables. Yet for Emily Parker, the atmosphere felt different. Several customers had already recognized the Bentley from photographs circulating through neighborhood social media groups. A few coworkers had asked questions she could not answer. Others simply watched her with curiosity. Emily ignored the attention and focused on her work. Around 7 o'clock, the front doors opened. Daniel Harrison stepped inside. Alone. No advisors. No executives. No Richard Cole. Just Daniel. He wore a charcoal suit and carried none of the confidence people usually associated with powerful men. Instead, there was something quieter in his expression. Something thoughtful. Emily noticed him immediately. So did the hostess. Within moments, Daniel was seated at his usual table near the window. Rain had returned to Manhattan, tracing familiar patterns across the glass. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Emily delivered sparkling water and a menu. Daniel thanked her politely, the same way he always had. Yet beneath the routine, both understood this was not an ordinary visit. Finally, after she finished serving another table, Daniel spoke. Do you have a few minutes when your shift slows down? Emily hesitated briefly before nodding. An hour later, the dinner crowd began to thin. She approached the table carrying a fresh cup of coffee. Daniel gestured toward the empty chair across from him. Please. Emily sat carefully. For a moment, neither said anything. The city lights shimmered beyond the rain-streaked windows. The restaurant seemed quieter than usual. Daniel studied the coffee in front of him. I have spent the last 2 days asking myself the same question. Emily waited. How did you know? She almost smiled. I did not know. Daniel looked surprised. Then why leave the note? Emily folded her hands together. Because I recognized something. Daniel remained silent. She continued. When I was 16, my father owned a small accounting firm in Brooklyn. He trusted his business partner completely. They had known each other for years. Her voice stayed calm, steady. One day, everything collapsed. Not because my father was careless. Because he stopped questioning the one person he trusted most. Daniel listened without interrupting. Emily glanced toward the rain outside. After that, I started paying attention to people. Not their words. Their patterns. She paused. Your friend looked nervous whenever you were not looking. Relaxed whenever you agreed with him. And he watched your reactions more carefully than he watched the conversation. Daniel stared quietly at the table. That was enough? Emily nodded. Enough to worry me. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel laughed softly. Not out of amusement. Out of disbelief. An entire compliance department missed it. Emily shrugged. They were looking at numbers. I was looking at a person. The answer lingered between them. Simple. Honest. Daniel slowly shook his head. For the first time in years, he realized that wisdom did not always arrive wearing a suit. Sometimes it arrived carrying a tray and refilling coffee cups. The conversation ended, but neither of them stood up right away. Rain continued falling beyond the window, soft and steady against the glass. Around them, the restaurant moved through its final hour of service. A waiter polished silverware. A couple laughed quietly near the entrance. The piano music drifted through the room like a distant memory. Daniel Harrison looked at the city lights and realized how close he had come to ignoring a warning simply because of where it came from. For years, he had built his life around expertise. Degrees, titles, credentials, boardrooms filled with accomplished people. Yet the most important insight he had received all year had come from someone who was never invited into those rooms. Emily gathered her hands around the warm coffee cup. What happens now? She asked. Daniel smiled faintly. Now I rebuild. The answer was simple, but honest. He no longer spoke like a man obsessed with winning. He sounded like a man who had learned something valuable. The following week brought changes throughout his company. New review systems were introduced. Decisions were examined more carefully. Assumptions were challenged. Employees noticed something else as well. Daniel began listening more. Not just to executives. To assistants. Analysts. Receptionists. Interns. People whose opinions had often been overlooked. The results surprised everyone, including him. Good ideas appeared in unexpected places. Problems were identified earlier. Conversations became more honest. Meanwhile, life at the Sterling Room returned to normal. At least on the surface. Emily continued serving customers. She continued arriving early and leaving late. She never told coworkers the full story. She never mentioned the letter. She never mentioned the conversation. Some experiences felt more meaningful when left unadvertised. Several weeks later, a package arrived at the restaurant addressed to her. Inside was a small framed photograph of the Manhattan skyline at sunrise. Beneath it sat a handwritten note. The handwriting was familiar. Thank you for reminding me that trust should be earned continuously, not inherited from the past. Emily read the message twice before placing it carefully inside her locker. Years passed. Their paths crossed occasionally. Sometimes Daniel visited the restaurant. Sometimes they exchanged a few words. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. Just mutual respect. The kind that survives because neither person asks anything from the other. One evening, long after the events of that rainy week had faded from public memory, a young employee at Daniel's company asked him a question during a leadership seminar. What was the most important business lesson you ever learned? The room expected a story about investments, acquisitions, or market strategy. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he smiled. Pay attention to the person nobody else is listening to. The audience laughed softly, unsure whether he was serious. Daniel was. Because years earlier, on an ordinary evening in a Manhattan restaurant, a waitress carrying a check folder had quietly changed the direction of his life. And he never forgot it. Sometimes the people who see the truth first are not standing at the head of the table. Sometimes they are standing beside it, unnoticed, waiting to see whether anyone is willing to listen.